So I'm sure that you guys have heard the news. Former President George H.W. Bush, who was a one-term president, has passed away at the age of 94 yesterday. Now, I wanted to do this video to give you guys 5 interesting facts about George H.W. Bush because he's a genuinely interesting president because he was a Republican, but there are a lot of caveats to his presidency. So, first off, I'm going to start off with what I consider to be the most interesting thing. So, there was a time where there were peace negotiations going on during his presidency between Israel and Palestine, and Israel wanted $10 billion in loan guarantees. And George H.W. Bush refused to grant those $10 billion in loan guarantees unless Israel froze all of its settlements in West Bank and Gaza. Now, that actually ended up being something that was really huge because we don't really see American presidents or anyone in legislatures in America to challenge Israel in any way, shape, or form. This was a really big thing. And he's really the last president to ever do anything to really challenge Israel. I mean, Obama, all he did is basically right on his way out, he decided to have, his UN vote. All he did was abstain from a resolution that just said it condemned Israel for its settlements, which doesn't actually do anything. It just comes out and says, we condemn you. That's it. Doesn't do anything. I don't consider that to be real action. But what HW did was huge. He actually refused to give them those $10 billion in loan guarantees. He refused. He said, if you don't freeze your settlements, we're not going to give it to you. So that was a really big thing. And that's really the last president to ever challenge Israel in any serious way, in any way, shape, or form. And it was really a commendable move. And AIPAC was all up in trying to lobby Congress to get those loan guarantees through. And I think he made some funny comment about it, saying it's me versus all them. The Israeli lobby in the United States is huge, the AIPAC organization. And that was a really big thing. And there was, I think, something like the Jewish vote for Bill Clinton was higher than it was for any other Democrat percentage-wise. So it was something that was pretty big. And it's never easy in the United States to take a real stand against Israel and their war crimes and things that they do and their illegal settlements and constant breaking of international law. So that gets a thumbs up for me, man. That's crazy. It's historic because we haven't had a president who really challenged them in any substantive way in a long time. Since then, pretty much. Now, the second thing is the Gulf War. Now, the Gulf War, known as Operation Desert Storm, basically Iraq invaded Kuwait, and what George H.W. Bush was, and the reason I have this as an interesting fact, is I wanted to differentiate his invasion to George W. Bush's invasion, his son. Now, George H.W. Bush went in, he cleared out Iraq from Kuwait, and what he did is he didn't actually overthrow the government. First of all, there was a huge coalition that actually went in there to do this. It was I believe they went through the UN. They went through all the process to do this, and then they pulled out, and it was considered a success because it was a success. And funny enough, then Secretary of Defense Dick Cheney was asked whether or not they would actually go in and overthrow Saddam, and his answer was, no, we're not going to go because it's going to result in some sort of a quagmire in which, okay, we overthrow the government, now what? Who are we going to insert? He said that in 1994, Secretary of Defense, but as VP, it changed. So he actually did that. He wasn't dumb enough to actually overthrow the Saddam regime. His son, on the other hand, was. So that's another interesting thing about his presidency. Now, another one is he famously said, read my lips, no new taxes. Now, that was obviously a big thing at the time, and it still is today, taxation. Conservatives, not fans of taxes. And so when he said that, it was a really big thing. But the problem was, and this started to make conservative voters really, eerie, and also probably contributed to why he lost in after his presidency was over. But basically, he said no new taxes, but the government had a ballooning deficit because I believe they started to get into a bit of a recession going, and the economy was sort of stagnating, but the deficit was rising really high, and so Congress and the president had to come together and figure something out here. And so he actually increased multiple taxes. I believe the alternative minimum tax went up a couple of percentage points. There was another one that went up a couple of percentage points. And so conservative voters were not so happy about that, because now you go from George H.W. Bush saying, read my lips, no new taxes. That was a huge thing. That was a very big thing at the time. And so he had to go back on his word because the economy required higher taxation. So that's something interesting. And these are very, very illustrative things about George H.W. Bush, because he's a different mold of Republican even from his own child. He's a moderate. He's actually a moderate. He did a lot of bad things, but he did a lot of things that made him look like a moderate. So the taxes, for example, the Gulf War was actually a legitimate mission. That was actually well executed. It wasn't a dumb unilateral thing. As Dick Cheney said, he's like, we're not going to go in unilaterally and overthrow the Saddam regime. He said that in 94, but it changed when he became vice president. So he was a totally different mold of Republican. Totally different. We don't see that. The Republican Party of then, and we know that he wrote a letter to Bill Clinton when he lost, and it was like this heartwarming letter of, we're rooting for you because you are the country, you are the head of the country, so we're rooting for you because we root for the country. The Republican Party isn't that way anymore. It just doesn't exist. He's a totally different mold of Republican.
Are you ready now to witness a power not seen for thousands of years?
Now, the fourth one is the Cold War formally and officially ended under his presidency. So George H.W. Bush was already very, very experienced in foreign policy. That was his main suit. He had a lot of experience in the foreign policy field. And as president, formally, officially, the Cold War had ended. That's something interesting as well. Now, the fifth thing that I want to mention is he, of course, ran in a primary against Ronald Reagan, and he actually called Reaganomics, which is trickle-down economics, supply-side economics, essentially the ideology that if you lower the taxes for the rich, it's going to end up trickling down on everyone else in the pyramid, which obviously doesn't work. It has never happened. But he called that voodoo economics, which voodoo economics is basically just one that it's asinine and it's fantasy and it's not actually legitimate and it doesn't work, it doesn't do anything. But George H.W. Bush is a really interesting person, and I was really fascinated to learn these things about him. Now, I had originally learned about the Israel thing because Christopher Hitchens talked about that, and it's really remarkable the different type of mold of Republican he is in comparison to today's Republican Party and his son's Republican Party. He's much of a different guy. And also, if I'm not mistaken, he had actually voted for Hillary Clinton. And there was, of course, a big time, battle in the Republican Party this past election cycle, this past primary cycle. Not only between Jeb, who was a sad loser, but Ted Cruz, of course, as well, and Donald Trump. And so George W., my understanding was George W. decided to just abstain. He didn't want to vote for either side. But George H.W. Bush actually voted for Hillary Clinton. So that says two things. One of them is it says a lot about Hillary Clinton. But two, it does say a lot about George H.W. Bush. And we can compile that because of things like the letter that he wrote to Bill Clinton and how he was actually a moderate on some of these issues. Now, again, I want to reiterate that there were a lot of bad things done under George H.W. Bush's presidency, but I wanted to take this time to talk about these specific things that were really interesting about his presidency, because I don't know if you're really going to find something like this. It's a Republican who was respectful, who was legitimate, and when his country needed certain things to be done, and when he had to take a legitimate stand like he did against Israel to actually not sabotage peace negotiations and said, hey, we're not giving you those loan guarantees unless you freeze your settlements in the West Bank. Unless you freeze them. That's a tough thing to do. I cannot explain how marveled I was that he actually did that. Not even Barack Obama can do that. No one can do that anymore. It's impossible. They are too scared. The Israeli lobby is so strong. I believe the Israeli prime minister at the time was really disappointed that AIPAC, despite lobbying in Congress, basically they backed away because I guess it really wasn't going to pan out for them. But HW, man, he's the last president to actually take a stand on Israel and actually, stand his ground and not just cave. So these are 5 interesting facts about George H.W. Bush's presidency. He died yesterday at the age of 94. That's a very long life, so there's no mourning, just, people to just look at his life and admire. And, that's how it is. He lived a long life, and he's a really interesting president, to say the least.